So I'd like to introduce today's speakers who are really just quite extraordinary. Dr. Robert Bullard is often described as the father of environmental justice. He is currently a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University. Dr. Bullard is an award-winning author of 18, yes, that's right, 18 books that address sustainable development, environmental racism, community reinvestment and resilience, climate and community resilience, and regional equity, just to name a few. Also joining us is Dr. Jasmine Younge. She is currently the executive director of the Georgia NAACP. Dedicated to the field of education and international affairs, Dr. Younge has served on faculty at several universities within the political science discipline since 2007. She currently serves as faculty at Kennesaw State University within the state government and international affairs. And finally, Ms. Cindy Marisol Benavides is currently Chief Executive Officer of the DC-based League of United Latin American Citizens, or affectionately known as LULAC, the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization in the country. She is a Honduran American immigrant who has experienced the American dream and now devotes her career to public service, ensuring that countless young people, women, and immigrants have the same opportunity. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us in this discussion. And we had the joy of doing a pre-call, and it just lit up. So hopefully we can do that again. And let me ask all three of you just to kind of step into the conversation that we started last week. So we talked a lot about, we can't really have this conversation unless we address systemic and institutional racism. Can each of you share how you have seen it rooted in the work you do, and what are some of the big challenges you're facing? Dr. Bullard, would you like to start?
Sure. And first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's important that we all understand that when we talk about change and social change, I'm a sociologist, and sociologists like to connect the dots. If we talk about every social movement that has been successful in this country has had young people and students and has really challenged the core of systemic inequality. We have to understand that racism is stamped in America's DNA. It's almost like as if we don't somehow acknowledge that, then we will always keep building on inequality. And so over the last 4 decades, I've tried to use science, research, policy, and civic engagement, connect those different entities to really change the way that we see people and society and people and power. And we've made, incremental steps, but right now we need transformative giant steps, because we don't have a lot of time to debate. The word for the day is urgency. Urgency.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. Dr. Younge, how would you like to respond to this kind of small question?
Yes, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I would like to really acknowledge this from a practitioner standpoint as well as a academic standpoint. Being a professor of political science, I've had the opportunity to study this area and really to look at not just the policy side of things, but also how that policy has impacted communities of color in particular. And I'll say from a policy standpoint that it has been over centuries intentional to have specific policies in place to stop persons of color from being influential in those particular circles. We can date back to specific Supreme Court decisions or legal cases that have been in place, and the decisions that have come out of those to really stop or even to continue the system. I mean, we can even date back to, even though overturned, Plessy v. Ferguson. But, we look at situations where we have Brown v. Bullard that overturned that precedent. However, we still have institutions and dynamics of segregation occurring. It's very, very clear. And also mechanisms in place to actually keep persons of color out of those circles that really have a significant impact on policy throughout the United States. I also want to touch on this from a practitioner standpoint, being in the position that I'm in today, and seeing firsthand how institutions have impacted communities of color, specifically in Georgia, to stop different communities from being impactful. Meaning the issues that exist within those particular communities that are adversely affecting persons of color, those particular arguments or issues, situations, criticisms often go unheard unless, we'll say, vehicles such as the NAACP step in, and individuals with notoriety, leadership in those particular organizations step in and show up and say, this is not okay, and utilize their push and their dynamic, whether that be through social media or even through interviews, to really put pressure on folks who reside in the positions, which oftentimes are not persons of color or persons who really can change those particular dynamics. However, we are seeing some change take place, but it is due to these vehicles that currently exist. Thank you.
Thank you. And Georgia is a really powerful example. Ms. Benavides.
Gracias, Dan, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be joining Dr. Younge and our iconic leader, Dr. Bullard. And I'm only reflecting on some of the quotes that I was taking down during our pre-session and, sharing with my entire team. And I will tell you that as we look at root causes and as we look at issues that impact our communities of color, I can't help but agree that oftentimes we look at incremental change as a solution. But in this moment of time, when you are seeing so many Brown and Black communities and our Asian American communities dying, we need impactful, transformative, immediate change. And we already know that some of these policies need to change. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, because only in America do we see some of these things happening. We call our immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are essential workers. They're working on the front lines, yet we fail to provide them essential protections, and we treat them as second-class citizens. When we look at our farm working community, many who are 80% plus Latino, again, they're working under conditions that in no other sector would it be tolerated, yet we allow it to happen to our farm working community. And these are the people who put our vegetables and fruits on the table. When we look at our education system, the fact is that 1 in 3 Latinos do not have access to technology and broadband. And yet when we look at our education system, our Brown and Black children are being left behind. We've seen a 400% increase in the number of Latino children who are receiving Fs. And I would even add on and on, because I could go on about this, Dan, for a long time. But looking at Georgia, and Dr. Younge, thank you so much for all the work that you've been leading in the state. Voter suppression is a way to undermine the political power of communities of color. In a state where we saw change take effect in 2020, what we're seeing now is a direct attempt to undermine the political power of growing communities like Latinos and our African American communities. And we have to understand that the fact that 47 states are enacting anti-voter suppression laws, that are enacting anti-access to our democracy laws, is intentional. And it's, as we look at the Latino community specifically, we know that Latinos today are 70 million strong, And in just 3 decades, 30 years, Latinos will be 130 million strong. And what that means in the context of America is that 1 in 3 Americans will be of Latino ancestry. That is a fact. That will happen. And so, Dan, as I think of these issues and, not to go into climate change and health and so many other areas where we see this institutional racism, there is a lot of work that we have to do still in 2021.
For sure, and precisely why we're having this conversation. So let's see if we can dig our hands now into the work. And in our pre-call, we hit a number of issues. And Dr. Bullard, you said 2 very important things that I think are important for today's conversation. One is this notion, this demand that we've got to flip the paradigm. And then you went on a little further and said, look, there are organizations and there are leaders that have been doing this work for decades and certainly generations if you take whole organizations too, here represented LULAC and NAACP. And right now, the world is open up and there are resources flowing, and making sure the distribution of those resources really support those who are deeply steeped in the work. So I'd love for you to share some of your insights and wisdoms with the group.
Well, those of us who have gray hair and have been doing this for decades, we not only write about history, but we've seen history being made, and some of us have made it ourselves. The long struggle for justice and this quest for justice, as you said earlier, is not a sprint, but it's a race. It's more like a marathon relay. You run your 26.2 miles, and then you pass the baton to the next generation to run the 26.2. Having done this for 40 years, we don't have 40 years going forward to get this right. And so the urgency of now means that we see so many converging threats to humanity. And whether it's climate, or whether it's the threat of democracy with voter suppression, or whether it's these health threats that people and organizations, whole parties are trying to take away healthcare, and weakening laws, the right to breathe, in terms of the right to have your kids to go to a school that's not threatened by an industry that's across the fence. So I think it's important that we see how all of these issues connect, that the environment, which is my area, it's more than trees, whales, ducks, and wetlands. It's where we live, work, play, worship, learn, as well as the physical and natural world. And so when we talk about the justice issues, we're talking about environmental justice, the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and eat food that's safe. Where we live, work, play, our kids have a right to not have a school that's across the fence from a refinery. And we have a right to a job that's safe and at a livable wage. People are dying for a job, but you shouldn't have to die on your job. So what we're seeing today is that these converging organizations, movements, and agendas now have been raised to the level that it's just one movement, and it's called justice movement. And because of this awareness of George Floyd and all these other murders, Breonna Taylor, that there's awakening that we need to do something about injustice. And because of this awareness, money is flowing. But we have to make sure that money follows need, and that the real groups on the ground, the institutions, the networks, the consortia that have legitimacy and authenticity, that are grounded in those communities 24/7, not parachuting in, but doing that work that's needed, get resources. And historically, money has flowed to money following money, money following power. And then those who are least are able to get access to power get left behind. That was always unacceptable, but it's really unacceptable today because of the intergenerational mobilization and the awareness that we have to get this right, because if we don't get it right, we will all go down. because of climate change, the impacts of these impending pandemics. It's not just the COVID. There is no vaccine for racism. We have to dismantle this evil system that is holding our nation back and making us not as competitive as we could be. Now, that's easy to say, but it's harder to do, but it's not impossible. But it means that we have to all step up.
That's great. We're gonna come back to this. Powerful, powerful frame. Dr. Young, when we were talking, kind of building on earlier conversation from Dr. Bullard, you said two very powerful things. You said, look, there's a disconnect now in the racial justice movement between the old machine and this kind of emerging new machine. And you yourself, I think, cut this really powerful role, like a number of the folks here, between both being a practitioner, capable and engaged with the grassroots, and also an academic who can really bring rigorous analysis and know the research to make sense of the lived experience. So how are you seeing a little bit of the Dr. Bullard's challenge of, like, how do we remain authentic to what we know, both from academics as well as the lived experience, in order to get the kind of systems change?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me also acknowledge, since everyone wasn't privy to our exchange, the old machine and the new machine that I mentioned. The new machine being this group of young persons, the emerging group of the late teens, early 20s, and late 20s, I'll say, who are really aggressive in terms of understanding social justice, but also the movement portion of it. They are excited to get involved in fighting for a cause, so to say, and speaking up, and they're not afraid to do so. However, then we have what I have called the old machine. The old machine, and not old necessarily according to age, but in terms of knowledge, experience, and things of that nature, who tend to produce a stronghold in terms of the way we used to do things and the way we were trained to do things, and then trying to implement that in the current. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of adopting some of the traditions and things that actually worked, however, we have to be cognizant of what's occurring today, and we have to be flexible to that. And I think the disconnect comes from the old machine saying, "Oh, well, this new machine doesn't know how to do this, and they don't have the years of experience that we do." And in terms of that, you end up having the disconnect, not only present, but also this new machine going off on their own, because now they feel isolated or feel as though they're not respected, that they don't have a voice. And so what has happened and what I've seen occur is that you have, avenues like Black Lives Matter, or other vehicles of change that are more in the present and have a large following. However, the old machine has not necessarily done what it is able to do, which is possibly pass on those traditions, teach the new machine how to really, really get into these old establishments that have been in existence for a very long time. And that key intelligence from the old machine could really, really help the new machine to be even more effective, and to really do or to really use their avenues of social change and their voices in social media to actually impact in the way that will have long-term effects versus just for the now. And that's what I mean as far as the disconnect. I think that if those two machines came together and even really appreciated the mentor-mentee possible relationship, then I feel like persons of color, communities of color, populations of color, even around the world, would be even more dynamic, because it would be a cohesive movement taking place versus kind of separate populations, because that's what I've witnessed. We have different populations making their own moves, still being effective, but we really have to look for a long-term strategy with this, because, you know, just doing something for now will produce results just for now. And you will see the movement back to what was before the just for now that took place.
So I'm going to come back. I think this is one of the questions of our day, right? Before I do that, I want to just also bring in LULAC and Ms. Benavides' I think important contribution in the pre-call around the work they do, particularly with intersectionality, right? That they bring the a look across multiple issues, education, immigration, and health, along with the kind of work with Black, Native, and people of color and Latinx community. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your work, how you navigate intersectionality, and a little bit, given that you're certainly seasoned, but a younger leader in the mix, representing this intergenerational talk. So I'd love for you to pivot off of that in your own work. LULAC is like NAACP. It's you know, kind of a stalwart in the civil rights movement, and yet they have a young dynamic leader. So take that anywhere you want to.
Thank you, Dan, for setting it up. And you know what I would say is that for us, working across partnerships, alliances, intersectionality is so very important. And the truth is, when you look at the Latino community, we wear so many hats. And you know, a lot of folks forget that you can be Latino and you can be a military service member. You can be Afro-Latino. You can be Latino and be LGBTQI. I mean, like, there's so many issues that impact us. And I'll just take the issue that we work closely with Soldier Vanessa Guillen, Dan. And what we were seeing was that, you know, here we had our local LULAC leaders, which are volunteer members, step in to increase awareness around what had happened to a missing soldier, Soldier Vanessa Guillen, but they were not getting the traction from the military. So then LULAC National stepped in to increase awareness nationally. And we did something very bold, which was we told our Latino parents to not send their children into the military. And why that was so very bold for us, Dan, is because we are a very patriotic organization. In fact, when you look at our symbol, it's red, white, and blue with stripes and stars. And we are based on the fundamental of democracy and citizenship in America. I would say beyond that, when we're looking at the issue of representation, and Dan, I will tell you, as the first Latina to lead LULAC in 90 years, to me, it's unacceptable that it took us 90 years to finally get a Latina in this position. But as I look across our nonprofit sector, the fact is that Latinos and communities of color are still not in key leadership roles, whether it's CEO or on the board of directors, representative of the communities that they serve. And so the issue of representation for us has been huge. So we joined something called Proyecto 20%, which is with 10 other Latino organizations, to demand and call upon the new administration to have at least 20% of their administration be Latino. And so we're very happy to see the appointments that have already occurred at the highest level, but we want to see that trickle down. We're also part of something called Latino Voices for Boardroom Equity. And believe it or not, Dan, in a state like California, where Latinos are close to 40%, when SB 826 happened, which was a bill that increased the number of women who serve on corporate public traded corporations in California, in a state, again, where Latinos are 40% of the population, of the 511 seats that opened up, only 17 seats went to Latinas. And so we had to circle back and support SB 979, which now called for people of color to be considered for these board positions on companies that profit from the Latino community and market to the Latino community. And so that issue of representation, I would say, is very salient in terms of the work that we do. But LULAC is also part of various coalitions, whether it's around COVID-19 and vaccination, or whether it's the Stop Hate for Profit campaign with ADL, the NAACP, Color for Change, going after ads that have misleading disinformation, specifically targeting whether it's Latinos or Brown or LGBTQ or Muslim communities online. And so we're looking at this in a really strategic form, because we know that when we come together, to Dr. Young's point, we can be more powerful. And we know that these issues, Dan, don't only impact Latinos. The issue of access to resources is an issue that impacts all of our communities. The issue of education equity and access to healthcare is an issue that impacts all of our communities. And I also want to point out that oftentimes who is not acknowledged and who is not at the table is our Native American community. And so, for us, it's so important that we also be conscientious as leaders in the room of who is not in the room. And I think for so long, our African American leadership has paved the way to crack the door open, but we're demanding more, right? We want to make sure we are at the table, uplifting the experiences of our communities. And oftentimes what we see within the Latino community, Dan, is an acknowledgement of what is happening. And so I've been looking at what is happening with our Brown communities and police brutality. The fact is that with our Latino community, it's not even covered by the media. So nobody ever hears about the person that died while being Brown in the hands of police, because it's not being covered. And so as we think of these issues and we think of how we work together, right now I know we're looking at a national Black, Brown, and Beige agenda, where we're bringing all of our communities together to focus on key issues that impact all of us, starting with economic access and opportunity, and making sure that as these decisions are being made at the highest levels, that our communities are top of mind.
Great. I wish the three of you weren't as passionate. It would just be nice if you could just have a little bit more energy. So let's dive in and see if we can get to kind of a tough issue. So I'm going to start with an easy question, but kind of hopefully sink us into it. If all of you could go back in time, and you are a 22-year-old activist, knowing what you know now, what advice would you think would be so important in order to sustain the change that you know in your current professional life is required to take the long view? And as Dr. Bullard pointed, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And he always puts this point, it's not just you're a sole runner, you're actually carrying a baton, you're in a relay race, you're on a team. So how you hand that baton off matters. So what is the advice you would give yourself if you were 22, rolling up your sleeves in this movement? I'm going to go in reverse order. So Ms. Benavides.
Gosh, Dan, I was thinking, what was I doing at the age of 22? And
well, so many of these wonderful, we've seen this extraordinary cracking open, right? Young people are just out there, and there's a belief that the world is uniquely cracking open in a way historically it hasn't in a generation or two. So that's what I'm after.
No, absolutely, Dan. And, I would say, if I was giving advice to my 22-year-old self, I think it would be centered around three things. One, to know my history, because for so long growing up, Dan, I did not know about the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, which in essence annexed the Southwest into the US. So many Latinos have never been immigrants in the US. They've always been here. And before Texas was Texas, it was Texas. And before New Mexico was New Mexico, it was Nuevo Mexico. And when we look at the history and even the names of the cities like Colorado, which means colored, there's so much history in that. And so I wish that I had known about narrative and framing and understood that I had a part in that. But I was very much a follower at the time. The second thing that I would say, Dan, is I wish that I had recognized and that I had known my voice. And it really took me until my 30s to finally understand how wonderful it can be to be a good troublemaker, to be that person that stands out in the room, that says what needs to be said. And believe me, I am like in heaven right now with Dr. Bullard, because he always says what needs to be said, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And so, I would say that's my number three. And my number three would be that, like, I wish that we understood that there are forces in play who want to divide our communities. And I was blessed that I had the privilege to attend an HBCU, Virginia State University, to understand the history of our African-American brothers and sisters and understand a little bit of the history that occurred in America, to see what is happening today, Dan, and see how there's forces at play that are trying to divide our growing largest population, Latinos, and our ever evolving, powerful African-American community. And so I would say, as I think of my number three, I think it's so important that we do recognize that when we divide our communities, we are less powerful, and that as we look towards the future, that we all have a hand in play to make sure that we continue to recognize what those barriers are, and that we intentionally, one, acknowledge them, but also strive to work together and even more strength to make sure that we finally knock down these barriers.
Thank you. So know your history, harness your voice, and stand in solidarity with those that are on the margins. Fantastic. Dr. Younge.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, I can agree with all of that. I think I'm going to piggyback and pick my top three. My first one would be proud, to be proud of my heritage as a young Black woman. Not that I wasn't, but I have seen too many times where Black women in particular are left behind in circles and treated in a certain, we'll say, light, according to society, that are not persons of color. And I think that oftentimes being viewed as possibly aggressive or a symbol of sexuality. There are all kinds of dynamics that go with that, and that's a whole different conversation. But I think that making sure that we as young Black women in particular are proud to be Black women, and not only that, see the value in ourselves. So I think that confidence is important, as well as the heritage. My second one would be to learn as much as possible about the impact of policy on my future. As a young person, being in my early 20s, you're not always cognizant of how policy and government, the laws that are passed, how they affect you as you age and become more responsible. And I say that in terms of possibly if you're one that wants to expand, your family, or wants to invest in real estate, or, you take on a job in a certain area or industry, how all of these things, taxes, I mean, let's just go to the basic line of that, all of these things, these policies that are passed, these laws affect really the dynamics of how you carry out your lifestyle. And I think as someone in your early 20s, you really don't understand that unless someone sits down and really explains it to you that, hey, this law is going to change how you pay back your student loans if you're a college student. Dr. Bullard's laughing at me because it's the truth. It's the truth. There are certain programs that may go away because of a certain law, or programs that may be implemented that may actually help you, and you don't even understand what that means or learn late, like 10 years after the law is actually passed. So I think that's really important for those early 20s to really understand how the policies are affecting you, especially as a person of color. As well, my third one would be do everything you can to get involved in the dynamics of policy making or the things that may affect your future. Partner with a mentor. For goodness sake, partner with a mentor in the field that you intend to navigate, or just an educator who you feel has been highly effective in your matriculation, education wise, or even beyond. That partnering can be a life changer. It can really, really help you to learn the things that you need to learn, to be exposed to the things that you need to be exposed to. I do believe in hands-on learning, and I think experience is the number one indicator of that. And such, that means that if you are literally journeying with someone who has been there, done that, and that goes back to my old machine, new machine, you really, really will be able to incorporate those things that you've learned, but also to possibly better those things that you've learned and implement them in real time and really have some real time impact.
Super. So stand proud in self, know policy thoroughly, particularly how it impacts your daily life and your future, and then get involved, particularly with policy. But you have a strong theme. Find a mentor, find the wisdom in your community, and shuffle up next to it and make sure you drink thoroughly from it.
Yes, yes.
That's great. Dr. Bullard, since we're all Trinitarians here, so what are your 3 pieces of wisdom that you would impart to yourself 45 years ago, since you've been doing this for a minute?
Yeah, thinking back, when I was 22, uh, this is the year, I think if I think back and count right, um, that I graduated from college. Dr. King was killed in Memphis over a garbage strike, environmental racism, environmental justice. I did not discover or make that link. We were fierce in the 60s, fighting for civil rights, but environmental was not really big. If I had to go back and Back to the Future, I was not really active until 10 years later, after I got out of the Marine Corps, finished my PhD, and moved to Houston in 1978 on and discovery of environmental racism and the impact of the environment on Black people and people of color and health. So I would wish I could have made that connection earlier, and to started my career working on this 10 years earlier. Maybe I could have worked with my other HBCUs, pulling them together back then, as opposed to 10 years ago, with our HBCU Climate Change Consortium and our HBCU Gulf Coast Equity Consortium and our National Black Environmental Justice Network. But realizing that the role of Black colleges and institutions was always there, but not really appreciating the power of the collective numbers working together, all 104, and the history of, and not really appreciating that history, even though I graduated from the Department of Sociology at Atlanta University, was founded by the Freedmen's Bureau, and the sociology department was founded by W.B. Du Bois. We took that for granted, but not appreciating in a way later on to see how our having strong Black institutions and mentoring students and sending them out in the world with expertise, experience, and a level of consciousness to give back. And having a strong foundation to appreciate that history, and that you're building on that history, and that you're building on a strong foundation that can push you forward. And again, even today, seeing that that history and that legacy unfolding as it impacts other populations. You know, HBCUs educate Black people, that was their mission, but anybody can go to an HBCU regardless of race or whatever, and to see whether it's the law school, the pharmacy school, the medical school, the science centers, et cetera, and see them basically carrying a load much larger than their physical footprint. Now that to me gives me the appreciation as to why I wanted to return to my roots. I left California. I left the University of California to come back to my alma mater, and then I came back to the school that gave me my first job out of graduate school. To that whole idea of giving back. Somebody helped you, so you got to help somebody else. I wish I had learned that earlier, and to really get it instilled in me as a mission earlier.
Well, I will say somebody who went into the Marine Corps certainly knew something about giving back in service. So it sounded like it was pretty early. So I'm hearing your route was you went the academic route where you had your kind of raising of consciousness, and you got involved. And had you been grounded a little bit more in the lived experience, it might have flipped earlier. But what I really heard you say is power building. You're like, if you earlier on figured out how to both mobilize and connect grassroots and leverage powerful Black institutions into a block, you could have driven change more quickly, which is a potent moment for now. So now, before we turn to questions from the audience, we'd really love for you all to engage. There's some interesting comments in the chat. I want to ask each of you, and whoever wants to go, you know, we live in a moment where there is this excitement about how much institutions and systems are actually under pressure to change. And you all have been at this a minute and know that there are very few straight lines to systemic change. So I'd love for you all, given what you're seeing now, to share your wisdom around, and Dr. Younge, you're in a particularly dynamic place right now in Georgia. You've just, you know, been literally part of a systems change with grassroots. So, you know, if I think we have 5 minutes till the end, so we got to be quick here. But I'd love for you all just to comment about what it takes for this notion of a long view and the tension around incremental progress versus, you know, kind of tearing it down, rebuilding, all of which are part of our thinking. So, Dr. Younge, why don't you go first, since you are sitting in the epicenter right now, one of the places of change.
Well, I will tell you that, and just to share a few examples of what I'm going to mention, I'll spin off on that in just a second. But I believe organization. This has been all about strategy and organization. There was a plan in place. This was not spur of the moment. We were not reactive. We were proactive. And I just want to give a few examples. There are things that were reported during the election that we were able to respond to, such as in rural areas that have very little resources, but we had a pipeline in place to where we could get communications and respond very, very quickly. We had situations where employers, believe it or not, were stopping, uh, uh, in particular, Black employees from being able to go vote by scheduling them to work at specific times of the day to stop them from being able to cast their votes. We had situations where advertisements were put out on the radio, actually talking to communities of color and letting them know in the voices of the persons who were running of times, incorrect times of voting precincts, just so that persons of color would not get to the polls to actually vote during the times that the polls were open. And so I think that it's very, very important to have that organizational strategy in place and to be able to react to those particular incidents with legal enforcement. That was something that was very powerful. We were actually able to take our legal team and invoke specific actions almost immediately when we received different kinds of reports of discrimination occurring, in particular within communities of color. So I think organization, strategy, and a particular plan in place are the mechanisms that we use, in particular, that work to really change Georgia.
Yeah, thank you. We're running out of time, but I want to make sure, Ms. Benavides, you have an opportunity, and Dr. Bullard. So Cindy, do you want to weigh in here?
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Dan. And what I would say is that our communities are resilient. And as I think of our immigrant communities, that they're also very much pioneering. And I don't know that I could do what my mom did, Dan, which was leave everything that she knew and come to the US with her 1-year-old daughter and her 2-year-old son. And I would also just mention, Dan, that it's so important that we also understand our role within the current context. And history is currently being made, even as we speak. And so as I think of what lies ahead, I think it's so important that we acknowledge that we need more representation and that we need more people at the table. And in today's world, to also acknowledge that women are being left behind. There was a report by, I want to say it was Forbes in February, that of the 346,000 jobs that vanished in January of this year, 80% impacted women. And so I want us to also be very thoughtful, always thinking of that intersection and how that impacts women in general, but women of color as well.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Bullard, last word.
Yeah, I think it's important that everyone understands there is today no substitute for organizing and organizations. This has always been the case. And that to be prepared and whatever barriers are thrown in front of you, we have to overcome them. You know, there was poll tax, literacy tests, counting how many jelly beans in a jar, all kinds of threats of lynchings. This is not new. We have to overcome all of that. And we have to, once people are elected in the office, we have to hold them accountable. Today, we have the equity lens, the racial justice lens. Those issues are they were on the ballot in November, and we won. And so if you look at the fingerprints of racial justice and the equity lens on the administration, Biden-Harris administration, as in terms of the appointments, in terms of the policies that are rolling out, it's not hidden. It's not something that is invisible. It's very overt. And there's a reason for the fact that we want to see action. We want to see not footnotes, but we want to see headlines that racial justice and economic justice and health justice, energy justice, criminal justice, all these things were on the ballot. And the fact that we want to see justice in the Justice Department and civil rights enforcement and all of those areas. And so it's there's a mandate and for this, and people are demanding. And again, it's about accountability.
Yeah.
And it's not rocket science. It is political science, but it's not rocket science. It's not smoke and mirrors. It's very easy to see what it is that we are dismantling a system of oppression that creates the inequality, and that we have to basically dismantle all of those systems that create inequality and unfair opportunities. It's just that simple.
First of all, just what is not simple is to just a debt of gratitude for the collective wisdom that you all have shared today. Quite powerful around intergenerational institutional power that knows history, harnesses voice, stands in pride of community and self, and drives with a clear-eyed view of what it takes to dismantle systems. So again, I just want to thank Dr. Younge, Ms. Benavides, and Dr. Bullard for your real just life work and taking an hour to share it with this community. It's been a real pleasure.